Good afternoon, or actually still good morning, everyone. I just want to wait a second for folks to file in as everyone's being admitted and their mics are coming on. This is the workshop for harnessing the power of K-12 policies for outer level prevention. We have a few presenters, but we're going to introduce our lead presenter, Maria Cole, MS, and also Chess is the prevention manager at Women Helping Women, a domestic violence and rape crisis center in Cincinnati, Ohio. During her time in the field, she has focused on developing and facilitating sexual and intimate partner violence prevention programs to alcohol-serving establishments, colleges and universities, and businesses and corporations. She has helped build two innovative prevention programs, Work Strong and It's On Us Bar Initiative, both of which center on the social ecological model. She values collaboration, inclusivity, and empowerment in her work. And I also have the privilege of having worked with her previously as well. So I'm also happy to bring her here as a previous colleague. So I'm gonna leave that there and take it away.
Awesome, thanks, Javon. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. If someone at OAESV could allow me to share my screen, that would be great. While that is happening, I am going to welcome my two co-facilitators to the space, Katie and Lisa. Do you all want to go ahead and introduce yourselves to the group?
Sure, I can go first. My name is Katie. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the prevention program coordinator at CERNCO.
And hi, my name is Lisa Hewendorf. I also use she, her pronouns, and I am a community education specialist within the Family Planning Division of Signature Health up in Northeast Ohio.
Awesome. Well, we're really excited for folks to be here with us today, albeit virtually. We're excited to introduce you all to the rubric that our work group created. Just as a little bit of a guide for today's conversation, we're going to go through who we are and kind of what our work group has been working on. We're going to cover the foundation and the research behind how we created the rubric and the model policy that goes along with it, and the process of creating that rubric. We're going to go through briefly the rubric elements. So you'll notice eventually that our rubric is pretty hefty, and it took us, I mean, at this point, almost a year to create the rubric that you're going to see today, which is a draft of what it will ultimately end up being. We'll do a little bit of an activity with you all, and we'll go through some successes and challenges. And really what we're going to talk about today is probably not new to a lot of you. I think that if you've been in the prevention field for the last couple of years, or even for the last 6 months or a year, depending on how new you are to the work, you've probably heard a lot of conversation around policy and outer level prevention, and folks kind of encouraging everyone in the field to really think about how we do prevention work in those outer levels of the social ecological model, which we'll talk a little bit about. So it's not necessarily going to be new information to you, but hopefully what you'll gain is a little bit of an understanding about why our work group was created, the work that we've done, and then where hopefully we hope to go in the future. So what we really wanted to start with is just an introduction to who the three of us are, and then where we come from a work group perspective. So the K-12 School Policy work group was created amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, when we were all kind of scrambling to figure out what our work was actually going to look like in a time when we weren't necessarily allowed to go into the schools and do individual level prevention work, when there were a lot of barriers to serving our different communities throughout the state of Ohio. So what OAESV and what ODH really thought up is the concept of quite a few different work groups that preventionists and folks around the state could join. And one of those work groups is the work group that we're a part of, so the K-12 School Policy work group. And for a lot of different reasons, this is important work. So we know that policies and procedures in K through 12 academic institutions are really shaping the culture around how students are experiencing life at school, their lived experiences at school. So what we have really sought out to do is create a rubric that preventionists and other folks working in the anti-violence movement around the state can use to review school policies. Any sort of student handbook that they have, any sort of procedures that they're adhering to, we want to make sure that our rubric is kind of covering it all. So you'll notice eventually that our rubric is pretty robust for that reason. Before we kind of jump into the meat of our program, I'm interested to know how much experience everyone in this space has working on K through 12 school policies. And I'm not sure, I haven't had the opportunity to check in with OAESV if they have been able to pull up the poll that we sent them. If not, we can probably just put this in the chat. And how about we actually just go ahead and do that? Let's go ahead. If you all could share with us how much experience you have working on K through 12 school policies. Do you have a little bit of experience? Do you feel like you have a robust amount of experience? Where do you feel like you fall on kind of the spectrum of that experience with K through 12 school policies? And I apologize, I can't really see the chat. So Lisa or Katie, if you can see it, I would love to know what our participants are saying.
Nothing in the chat yet. I think they're thinking real hard on it.
Awesome. And there's no judgment in this space. So I think all of us at one point we're new to this field and new to this movement. And so if you have no experience, that's totally fine.
So some responses in the chat are little. And then another, we've done one project in the year I've been here. One is well informed and read on the topic, wanting to align agency curriculums with the standards for SEL. Another is, I personally don't have any experience. My work is with adults, but wanted to learn and expand my knowledge.
Awesome. That's so good to hear. So we're kind of all over the board, which I really love. I like to have kind of that diversity of experience in the presentations that I do. So I know that from a work group perspective, we all came to the work group with varying levels of experience too. Some of us have done a lot of work in the policy realm, and some of us haven't done any work. So I think you'll hopefully get to see that factor into the way that we created the rubric. All right. Any other responses, Katie?
Yeah, there were a few more. So someone said they have teaching experience. Another person said virtually none, but I am familiar with the policies of the schools I work with. And then the last one said I have been in prevention for 2 months, so no experience yet.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, in that case, we will move on and dive into the meat of our program.
We wanted to start off with our foundation. I also have my cat in my lap, so sorry if she makes an appearance. She loves when I'm presenting. So our foundation, we wanted to start by acknowledging the hard work and guidance of anti-oppression educators and activists. The work group process began with foundational anti-oppression sessions, and we're incredibly grateful for the wisdom and passion of those workshop facilitators. So among them are Dr. Arki, Dr. Dent, Carmen Bolivar, Amanda Haupt, Siraj Rahim, and Dr. Mack. And we are also supported in our process by Dr. Wasco in terms of envisioning what progress looks like and what goals we have. And as we're familiar, the theme of this conference is restoring our roots. And in thinking of that, I was reminded of the quote from Dr. Angela Davis. She said, "Radical simply means grasping things at the root." Not only does this quote push back against the demonization of radical activists, it also reminds us that the work has to focus on the roots of oppression. And in doing that, we want to allow room for justice to flourish. Ready for the next slide, please? So if you have been in prevention for a while, you'll probably familiar with the social ecological model, which is what we have here. And we understand our work as preventionists within many frameworks, but one of these is the social ecological model. There are entire courses on this model, but essentially we want to focus on where we place our work within it. So the social ecological model shows the nested levels of interaction within a society and allows us to map out risk and protective factors. The interplay between and within those levels is complex. At the most basic level, we understand the smallest circle to be the individual. That represents each person's history, age, gender identity, income, education, etc. At the next level, we have relationships. So this looks at relations among close friends and family, close peers. Next, we have community. This is where we focus on settings like schools, communities, and workplaces. So how can you change the environment to promote safety, et cetera? The final level in this version of the model is society. And at this level, we focus on the social and cultural norms that promote violence, as well as policies that perpetuate inequality. And this is where we see our work fitting in. And we're focusing our energy here because it allows us to tackle systemic issues. The work of helping individuals harmed by policy is important, but as preventionists, we also want to change that policy to prevent future harm. And we probably know from the river analogy that we have to go further upstream. That means looking at the conditions that can lead to violence or prevent violence. That means targeting social norms, creating protective environments, and ensuring policies are equitable and just. So that's where we see our work within this model. Big one, awesome. So what can policy do? We talked about some of this on the previous slide, but we really want to lay out exactly why we see policy change as important work. We narrowed it down to 4 benefits that overlap. So policy can be used to create protective environments. If you state that violence prevention is a statement of care for members of community. So it creates that protective environment, but it also sets that norm, which is set positive social norms, that helps communicate shared community values, that we all value safety and inclusivity and connectedness. We also have established support for survivors and a building of an equitable environment. So we just really want to look at the way that it can fit into any or multiple of these 4 categories. That's the summary of our grounding theory and location of our work within the social ecological model. Now I'm going to hand it over to Lisa, I believe, to talk about the details of our project and process.
All right, yes, thank you, Katie. So we had quite a lengthy process to create the rubric. If anyone else on the call has been in the work groups the last year or so, I think many of them were kind of similar, where it was getting our grounding and figuring out exactly what we wanted to do, collaborating, as well as, allowing time and space for the rest of our jobs that still needed to be worked on behind the scenes. So this is sort of our process to create the rubric. So first we started just with some idea sharing throughout the work group members. To establish what we wanted our goals to be, some outcomes, hopefully something tangible in order to be able to share with other folks within the state, other preventionists. So our focus on school policies, we wanted to think about what we each would find valuable, talking about our experiences that we've had as well with doing school policy reviews, if any, what we would think would be most useful for us and other preventionists. So then we kind of dove into some research. So looking at different evidence-informed articles, different literature, things that we could use, that other folks have already done some of the hard work. So kind of compiling a bunch of the info rather than reinventing the whole wheel. So we each chose a couple of articles and literatures to review and then reported back to the group. Primarily they were provided by ODH. They had already done some research and had a lengthy list of topics that we could look over. So a few examples of that literature was from the Ohio Department of Education, both their PBIS resources, the Positive Behavioral Intervention, as well as the Anti-Harassment and Intimidation Policies. We looked at the Futures Without Violence, their Start Strong guidebook. There was the Women's National Law Center, and then the CDC's Veto Violence, their Dating Matters policy examples, as well as a few others, but just some for the background. So our next step then was to create the actual rubric. So this was where we started adding in elements and what topics did we think were valuable to have in any school's policies. So the rubric started off with a rating scale, the model policy language, as well as a space for notes and recommendations that a preventionist could provide to a school. So I will go an example of those in just a minute. So as we started filling in those different elements or different topics, we then had to populate them with what we would look for. What do we want in the rubric to make it, a model policy? So the members then had to sign up for different policy elements. I think we have 29 or so. So it was kind of a process, as Maria said, it was robust. So we each signed up for a few elements that we were either passionate about or had some expertise on in order to use different resources and populate what we think the policy should look like. Then we also did peer review, several rounds. where once each element was completed, someone else would go through and read it, make comments, make edits, suggestions, which we did a couple of different times to get different input from several folks. And then we tried to make sure that all of those comments and edits were resolved. Some questions brought up throughout during our meetings, so we could kind of get some live interaction with that. So that was probably, I think, the most valuable piece of the process, at least from my point of view, because what I think is one thing is, different from someone else's point of view, different experiences. So that peer review process was lengthy, but definitely, I think, very valuable and a good use of our time. And again, with how many categories we had, it did just take a little bit of our time as well. And then our final product was separated into the rubric, which includes a scale. There's model policy with language, as well as a glossary, and then our citations. So we tried to make this as user-friendly as possible. We did have several versions, which thank you to Miss Katie Swindler, who is very adept at making the rubric and using Google Forms or Google Drive and all of that for us to be able to keep reorganizing and reestablishing what we want it to look like. So the next slide, please. So here is our list of all of the elements, is what we're calling them, or topics that we feel that the school policies should have. So this could ideally be in like school handbooks, where we felt that most youth would probably look for these policies if they wanted, but also in their actual policies, at the district level, oftentimes they have similar different elements and categories. So these are the ones that we came up with. As I said, I believe there's about 29. We wanted it to definitely be comprehensive, so that's where I think we are at this point. We also wanted to cover topics that they probably should already have in their policies, but maybe could use some updates or some extra preventionist, je ne sais quoi, if you will. So those things like having the distribution plan like that, they should already have that, but is it as effective as it could be? The definitions of power-based violence and harassment, intimidation, bullying, those can always be expanded or be more specific. They may need updates over time with, technology and different types of harassment we might be seeing. But then, as you may be able to see, a few of them are maybe a little bit more like tangentially related to violence prevention. It may not be the first thing you'd think of when you think of a school policy, but that was kind of, I think, even a bigger goal of ours, was to go above and beyond. There's always room for more to add in, more improvement to be as comprehensive as possible. So we will go over a couple of these in the activity. So I'm sorry, I have an alarm going off for some reason. Later on in the session, but these are our overall elements for now. Next slide, please. So here is an example of one element within the rubric. So it is including the scale, a couple of different expectations, and then it's got the space for the recommendations from a preventionist. So this is meant to be used by preventionists to provide feedback to the school and go through it with them. This is one of the elements, as you can see, is the school has parent and family programming. So that is something that some schools may or may not have. And if they do, is it in writing? Is it evaluated? So we wanted to kind of cover that in one of these elements. Before that, you'll see that it says IE5. So we came up with kind of two different subsets of our rubric elements. So the IE stands for the institutional elements, where these are things that the school essentially would need to put effort into. They would need to put it into practice. It is like an action that they would need to put into place. Whereas the other subset is the policy elements, where some of the ones I said earlier, they should already have like the definitions, how to report abuse or harassment, those sorts of things that are more the procedures that are just in writing. So as you kind of look across, there is the rubric or the scale. So we went from 0 to 4. We felt that there should be a 0 if it's completely missing, especially since some of our categories were a little bit maybe new to some folks. We wanted to, not in a negative way say it's a 0, but that something is just missing and could be included to improve their policies. And then going up to the 4, it would be the best of the best, which I think a lot of them are in pretty good detail. So we wanted to be specific, have kind of high expectations, because as I said, there's always room for improvement. So just because you have school and parent or school, family and parent programming, what does it look like? Could there be more times that it's available? Could it be more times throughout the year? Is it provided by, someone in the school? Is there an expert that has some kind of input? So different ways that we could try and suggest it to be included and or improved. So then below that, it says the text of this section is, and then we have these 4 checkboxes. So these are just, I don't know, the different ways that we felt that all of the sections should all have those. It kept coming up throughout, and we were each putting it in several of our elements. So we decided just to include it for every single one. So these are also included in our glossary to make sure that the school staff know what exactly these might be, looking for. So we are hoping that they're all accessible, they're readable, they're easy to find, they're understandable and easy to follow along. Developmentally appropriate, especially for, the population as well as the culture of that school, and then gender inclusive, as well as trauma informed. So that, I think trauma informed was definitely a big conversation throughout our work group as well. For different categories or different elements, what does that look like? So that could definitely follow then down into the next section, the notes and recommendations, where we would be able to leave comments or suggestions for those administrators to take into account and try to implement into their actual policy or handbooks. And the next slide, please. So then this was sort of our separate document that is kind of more on the prevention side, but can be, helpful to, give certain sections potentially to school administrators. So this is our model policy and some example policy language. So at first we had this all in one big document, and it was excessive. It was very cumbersome, a little bit harder to follow at that point, and also just kind of overwhelming even for us who had created it. So we did decide to sort of create the blank rubric with the scale and the space for comments, and then use this model policy piece for sections that maybe were lower on the scale. And here is basically what we would say would be the best of the best. So there's the model policy, which kind of just has generic things of what you should include. Some of them, based on what is legally expected for schools to include, and then also example policy language. So someone could really, if necessary, essentially copy and paste some of these pieces, hopefully adapt them, of course, to their population and all of that, but make it, here's an easy way to fulfill that number 4, or at least improve themselves on that scale wherever they may have already been. So this was, I think, a very valuable piece as well, which can always be a living document. I think we're probably going to continue to add to this for the rest of our lives, I feel, because there's just always more things that come up and new things that you learn, new terms that come up, and ways that we could improve these policies for sure. So this could be used to provide that specific feedback, as I said, to increase that rating and hopefully get them as close to a 4 as possible. And I think that that's all I have.
Awesome. So now we want to take you all through an activity. And it's honestly similar to the process that we did at the beginning or toward the beginning of creating the rubric and brainstorming about the rubric. As you can see on the screen here, we have a couple of the different elements highlighted for reasons, just because not all of the ones that we highlight are immediately thought about in conjunction with anti-violence prevention work. So I think, again, if you've been in the field for quite a few years, you probably do automatically kind of connect gender inclusive language to sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. But if you're new to the field, you might not necessarily make that connection automatically, and that's totally okay. But one of the reasons why we think that the rubric is so comprehensive, and one of the reasons we made it so comprehensive, is because we want to make sure that we're covering all of our bases. And we want you as program participants to have the opportunity to kind of brainstorm and really think through why we might have included these elements in our rubric. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move through a series of slides, and I'm going to ask on each blank slide for you all to brainstorm why we might have included, or why we think it's important that these specific elements are included in our rubric. We'll give a little bit of a background about the reasoning behind why we included them in the rubric after we have each one of those brainstorming sessions. And I'm going to ask that you all either use the chat box, or you can unmute yourself, of course. We would love to hear your voice, or you can use the Zoom annotate function, which can be found in, I guess, the toolbar up probably toward the top of your screen or maybe toward the bottom of your screen. So it's not, so if you go to the top or the bottom of your screen, you should see an annotate functionality. If you click on that annotate functionality, you should be able to write text on the screen. There should be like a stamp option. There should be maybe an option to draw on the screen. And really, we're proponents for any way that you want to communicate your ideas to us. So if you feel like you want to annotate on the screen, that's awesome. If you want to use the chat functionality, that's great too, or unmute yourself. So we'll go through the same process for each of these different elements that are highlighted. So, and we really do want to really learn from all of you too. So one of the great things I think about our work group is the fact that we all did come from different areas of the state. So we're all working with different populations, and we all come with a little bit of different experience in how long we've been in the movement, where we work in the movement, all of those types of things. And I think that that's important for all of us to kind of honor and recognize in this process too. So let us move on to the first element. So in regards to gender inclusive language, we thought it was important to set the expectation that schools are using gender inclusive language throughout their policies. So incorporating the use of they, them pronouns instead of using he, she to identify students, talking about relationships in a non-binary, non-straight way, in policy examples for both students and then guardians and caregivers. So I'm curious, why do you all think this element is important to include in SIV school policies? So like I said, you can use the annotate function, you can chat it in, you can unmute yourself, however you want to share your ideas with us. And again, I apologize, I can't see the chat. So Katie or Lisa, if you can moderate that, that would be great.
Yeah, someone already had an answer in the chat. Creates a safe space for LGBTQ youth.
Absolutely. Why else? You could also share what your experience has been in reviewing policies. All right, so let's see here.
So you can also kind of move around what you typed. Yeah, awesome.
Oh, okay.
Someone else in the chat said it makes everyone feel included.
Yep, absolutely. And on screen we see helps folks see themselves represented in policies. It is part of the SEL standards set forth by and expected from the Ohio Department of Ed. Absolutely. Allows everyone to feel safe.
Someone in the chat said that safe space also creates more open space for reporting or addressing sexual harassment / harassing language.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also, it creates a space for inclusion and respect.
Yes, and minimizes assumptions about students. Any other ideas? All of these are kind of exactly what we kind of thought about when we were coming up with this element for the rubric. So you all are spot on.
Someone else said, we also know that LGBTQ+ population is at higher risk for sexual violence.
Yes, absolutely, 100%.
Can I add a quick comment from yesterday's sessions, I think? So I was thinking about this because a couple of the sessions yesterday were talking about like gender neutral language. And someone had brought up the idea of like, instead of gender neutral, saying non-binary language, because gender neutral or non-binary, just the way that we then assume that there is a binary. So I kind of want to pat us on the back because I sort of like our gender inclusive language term better than non-binary language or gender neutral language, if that made sense.
Yeah.
I think that maybe this is a little bit even more overarching than saying non-binary or gender neutral.
Mm-hmm.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
Someone else in the chat said it opens space for exploring different identities.
Yes, I love that. All right, I'm gonna save this annotation and then clear it out. and then give you all a little peek into our minds. So I think we already kind of talked about a lot of these. You all mentioned a lot of these different elements, but a few of the points that we thought we would talk about explicitly is the fact that when schools use gender inclusive language, all students feel supported. It sets an example for how the students should be speaking to one another and sets the expectation that the school is an inclusive environment. And then all students will feel empowered in the policies and hopefully will feel like they belong. They are likely to reach out for help if they know that this is an issue that affects everyone, not just one subset of the population. So, and I think most importantly, it really does create a norm of inclusivity at school or at a specific school. So you've probably heard in especially the prevention world, we want to reshape those social norms that we all have, and we want to create new social norms that are hopefully more healthful. And one of those social norms that we really want to reshape is that norm of exclusivity versus inclusivity. And I think that this element really does speak to that pretty well. All right. If everyone is ready to move on, we'll go on to the institutional element number 2 that we want to move through. So for those of you who are not aware, zero tolerance policies are school discipline policies that impose predetermined, automatic, typically harsh punishments, such as out of school suspensions and expulsions for a wide range of school violations. And these policies were actually originally adopted to address serious and oftentimes violent offenses, typically outside of the school environment in the carceral systems. But this punitive policy has actually been enforced most recently in cases of minor misconduct, and children, especially children of color, are being over-disciplined for minor nonviolent offenses. And we see this happening all over the state of Ohio and schools all over the state. So I'm curious, why do you think that this policy or this element was important to include in our rubric? What are your thoughts?
Someone in the chat said it isn't trauma informed and ignores what issues may be at the core of students' quote behavior.
Absolutely. What are other ideas?
Research also shows that it may have no improvement on school safety.
Yeah. On screen, it says it's also not how children learn. Punishment rarely teaches humans the behavior intended for us to learn. Absolutely. And I mean, when we're thinking about schools, the overarching goal for a lot of schools is to teach students and to help students learn. And if we're not facilitating that process, what are we doing? We're causing harm.
Someone else in the chat said it is a deficit concept that is giving up on children. Someone said it singles out children.
Absolutely. And it's singling out most often the students who already don't feel included in that school environment.
Discriminatory use of the policy against LGBT+ students of color. We sometimes also see this being used against students practicing defensive behaviors versus offensive behaviors, where the offender was not seen engaging in policy breaking.
Mm-hmm.
It often ignores children with disabilities too, like neurodivergent children.
Yes.
We knew we would get great answers from y'all.
I know, they're such awesome answers. Any other ideas?
Someone said, it's just bad, okay? Agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
I also appreciate, I think it was Emily that said practicing defensive versus offensive behaviors, because I know that comes up when I teach in schools a lot doing bystander intervention. Like I'm trying to teach you how to safely de-escalate, And in some situations that your first thought might be to separate the people if there was like a physical or heated argument. And I have to strongly encourage over and over again, like, you may be putting yourself in an unsafe place, you know, physically as well as with the school. So I think that I agree that that's definitely a huge issue where we see a kid that's near the fight and we assume the worst, and that's not helping anyone. They were trying to potentially, you know, stop the problem from getting worse.
Right. Absolutely. All right. Anything else in the chat? All right. I'm going to save this annotation, clear it out, and give you, again, a peek into our mind when we were creating this specific element on the rubric. So zero tolerance language separates the school environment from the carceral system, since zero tolerance policies have aided in the school to prison or community to prison pipeline for decades. So by removing this language, hopefully we're separating the carceral system from the place where hopefully students are learning. It creates an environment where students can trust adults and have caring relationship with adults at schools instead of lacking trust, because most often when we're seeing zero tolerance policies enacted at schools, we're losing that trust built between the students and the adults in that environment, whether that's faculty at that school, so the teachers, or whether that's folks in the front office where students may be interacting with them on a pretty regular, maybe daily basis. It gives educators the opportunities to create trust with students without feeling the need to rely on school resource officers or punitive measures. We know that school resource officers often do not make schools safe for students, especially students of color and students from other marginalized identity groups. And so hopefully enacting no zero tolerance policies within a school, again, we're creating those lasting staff and student bonds, which again, thinking about our movement and the topics that we're covering in the anti-violence movement, these students might not necessarily have role models for healthy relationships at home or in other places in their lives. So if we can really try to build those bonds in the school environment as much as we can, we're hopefully creating those protective environments that will decrease perpetration of sexual and intimate partner violence later on. And then it also creates opportunities for students to make mistakes and learn from them and do better next time. We know that students, as well as us as adults, are going to make mistakes all the time. And it's important that schools have policies that allow for mistakes to be made and allow for, again, learning to be done after those mistakes are made. So I think this was one of the, at least for me, this was one of the elements that we came to a little bit later on, not that we were excluding it specifically or explicitly. It's just that as we did more and more research and as we figured out exactly what our rubric was going to look like, this was an element that was clearly feeding into many of the other elements that are included in the rubric. And it was kind of a no-brainer when we chose to add it to the rubric. And it's one that, again, schools might not be thinking explicitly about right now, but that it's our job as preventionists to bring it to their attention and to hopefully make those explicit connections for them. And I'm noticing that the chat is active. So what comments do we have in the chat?
So we have someone that said the students may take this info home and teach their parents. Someone else said schools with these policies will definitely create some good changes at home. I think fewer kids getting in trouble at school would mean fewer kids coming home and getting in trouble for getting in trouble at school. And so the parents would see this work.
Yeah. Oh, such good. Yeah, such good insight there. Awesome. Okay, moving on.
Dress codes. This is one that's near and dear to my heart. So not everyone would really see the connection between dress codes and violence and inequity. But when we talk about dress codes, maybe not everyone had these same policies, but in my memory, it's that your shorts go to your fingertips, or to your knees, or you have to bend over to see if a skirt rises up too much, or you're not allowed to wear sagging pants. You can't have bra straps showing. There may be certain dress codes for professionalism at school or mandatory uniforms that may or may not be funded. So there are a wide range of dress codes, including hairstyles. So why would we include dress codes in our rubric? So someone said they normalize victim blaming and regulating girls' bodies. Yep. We talk about dress codes a lot in terms of like rape culture, where it's like, oh, well, your shoulders were showing. Someone said it could be another gender neutral issue as well. Yep, that's huge. Making sure that dress codes aren't like rigidly enforcing a binary that people don't fall on. Objectification in general, but especially as they tend to be inconsistently applied, particularly with girls of color and who are larger, curvier, absolutely. As we see other policies inconsistently enforced, this is another huge one where not only are policies specifically tailored to recreate those racial inequities, but they're also seemingly race neutral, but they're targeting girls of color or enforcing it only for some folks. Someone said many rural schools have no AC and it's hot. Girls sitting there sweating and boys in shorts and tanks. Yep. Someone said what is considered inappropriate, that becomes objective, words, length, etc. Yeah, it's absolutely objective, like what's inappropriate for you, that sort of thing. And someone brought up it can often be used to promote race and sex discrimination. Absolutely. So again, this creates a culture of inclusivity and safety. Yep. Y'all are on top of it. Someone said it continues to deflect the need to educate boys on healthy relationships and responsibility and actions rather than putting some illusion of responsibility on girls. Yep. I saw snaps from Lisa.
Can I also add really quick that I've heard from, I think it's at least 2 different male teachers the last couple of years who said that they don't enforce the dress code because as a male teacher, they don't want to be accused of sexual harassment for looking at a female student in that sexual way. So it's like a catch-22, like no matter what, we're hypersexualizing, particularly females, but as people said, also depending on their size, their race, it just turns into so subjective, like someone said in the chat, like who says what's inappropriate or not. So either way, they're useless if no one's going to enforce them.
And someone said, and that culture can be part of the way people dress or do their hair or even tattoos and piercings. Absolutely. There have been a number of dress codes that are trying to say that, you know, folks can't wear locks, which is a racist dress code policy. So I think y'all got a lot of what we were going to talk about. Sorry if you heard my AC kicking on in the background. So essentially, when we were including dress code in our rubric, our main thoughts were that we need to get rid of those dress code policies that disproportionately harm girls, especially girls of color. And when they are being punitively disciplined because of dress code violations, that decreases education and opportunity equity. They are removed from class. They don't get to learn alongside their peers. And they're also singled out and humiliated in front of their peers. And this also refuses to perpetuate rape culture and harmful social norms. So someone brought it up in the chat where it's saying, well, you know, she was showing her shoulders, so she obviously deserved to be catcalled, or she's a distraction to boys and she is responsible for managing other people's reactions or actions. This also allows students to feel comfortable, valued, and able to express themselves. Someone mentioned it earlier with allowing folks to dress in a way that is meaningful to them and that represents their gender or their gender identity or the way that makes them feel able to participate in a school environment and whole and seen. And then it also centers accountability and rejects victim blaming. There are some model policies for dress codes where it explicitly states, we recognize that everyone has the autonomy of their own body, where we want everyone to have autonomy over their clothing, how they present themselves. And we recognize that everyone must take responsibility for their own actions, but not the actions of others. So that's why we included dress code.
All right, so our next element here is removing police from schools. So similar to the intentions behind the no zero tolerance language policy piece we just went over, police being present in schools can obviously change the environment and overall culture. So wondering how that might impact facets of a student's day-to-day, their experience, and wondering why you all thought it was important for us to include this element in our rubric. To kind of expand removing police from what our research showed, that could also include things like metal detectors, fences, or even barbed wire potentially, and having armed school resource officers, whatever title they may have, if they present similar to police. So a little bit more expansive there. So again, go ahead and use the chat and or annotate. Why is this one important? All right, so someone said, well, it immediately can trigger any trauma connected to the police or institution. Absolutely. We know that some kids may have that experience already, or maybe family members, and that can be a trigger every day they walk into school. It diverts resources better used for youth support. Yes, thank you. It's definitely a very good point. Which you've probably seen a little bit in, real life in the news, the last couple of years, months, whatever time it is these days. I don't know, it's kind of irrelevant. That, if we do, what do they call, defunding the police, what does that look like? What else can be in the community to prevent, violence? Someone said it's not shown to actually make schools safer. It's really interesting to look at the differences between staff and student opinions on, I'm guessing SROs, school resource officers, and between the school system I grew up in, Youngstown, compared to the rural schools I work in Wayne and Holmes counties. So Emily, if you want to maybe add on that, I'm kind of curious, what do you see as the differences between the opinions with the differences between the staff and the students' opinions? I'm just curious if there's like a specific thing that came to mind. And then on screen, it inherently sets the expectation that there will be violence without addressing the causes of harm, violence, or trauma, etc. So yeah, by having, intense security or police, we are assuming the worst of these kids right off the bat, not giving them the trust or respect that maybe they could deserve, which could in their own build autonomy to prevent it in the first place. Schools often default to using SROs to handle of the behavior issues that can be easily navigated by a school social worker or counselor. Great point, yes. Instead of doing the hard work, we do the quote unquote easy work by kicking them out of class, kicking them out of school. The justice system will figure it out, or the parents will have to figure it out, and that's usually not proactive.
In a fun crossover between the last slide and this one, there's also basically guidance saying that a school resource officer should never be in charge of dress code policy.
Good point. Okay, thank you. So yes, Emily, I want to ask you to clarify. Many of our staff are in support of them, whereas students don't feel safe, they feel watched and controlled. Okay, yeah, that makes complete sense, I think. I know in my experience, there's once in a blue moon, there's like the resource officer that's like the friend to students, but at the same time, is that effective? Because your friend is now gonna have to kick you out of school if you misbehave or do whatever rule that they don't approve of. So yes, staff, again, maybe assuming that it helps, whereas students see it as harmful. In the rural schools that I'm in and grew up in, they have contacts with the sheriff for SROs and do not have a full-time social worker. Ooh, okay. So we've got a couple of problems there, yes. But again, going back to, you know, the capacity of each school, different environments, different cultures, where can we get those resources to have social workers or other trained staff that can do the work of you know, what we expect the SROs or police to do, and hopefully in a better way, of course. Don't just have a social worker on site to claim that you have a social worker on site. Anything else? Give you another second here. Okay, well, we can go on to the peek into why we decided to include this one. If there's any chats, I will continue to look at those. So by removing police in schools, we hope to be able to reduce the disproportionate effects on marginalized populations, particularly people of color, which we kind of already mentioned a little bit earlier. That we can also create an environment free from fear and intimidation, as I sort of said with some of y'all's other answers, that just having the presence of someone in full uniform or with a taser or a weapon immediately makes me on edge, and that is not conducive to a learning environment whatsoever. Preventing the continuance of the school to prison pipeline, which I believe one of my co-hosts already mentioned as well, that idea of getting kids in, you know, extreme trouble in school for possibly minor misbehaviors or misunderstandings, that can just encourage them to later on end up in the justice system. And as we know, that is not very conducive, again, to them building social emotional skills or having options for other schooling, for other education, for careers, that can obviously have long-term impacts if that's their future that they see. It can also help to focus on adapting and learning from behaviors, which again, we mentioned with the zero tolerance. But again, just kicking someone out of school does not make them learn what they did wrong was wrong or make them want to improve it. Again, thinking about bystander intervention skills, I always say, like, when a teacher tells you to just quit it, you just roll your eyes and you just keep doing whatever you were doing. You're not learning why that behavior was a problem. So if we just kick someone out of school or, you know, worst case, you know, get them arrested for something, we're not teaching them how to change that behavior. We want to move towards restorative and transformative justice. I know those are not the same thing, but for the sake of our presentation today, just moving past that punitive or carceral justice that we often see with having police in schools. And then, as someone aptly mentioned, the resources can go towards prevention and creating a culture of safety. So making sure that we are training staff, ideally all staff, in de-escalation, you know, how to communicate with students instead of just calling for security whenever someone raises their voice, other ways to prevent or intervene in a safe way. So all of those different things that could be, as you said, put our resources towards something more long-term and more impactful and supportive for students. All right, not seeing any other additions, we'll go on to, I believe, our last element here to see what you all think about this one. So comprehensive sex education, why is this element important? So sexual and reproductive health education can sometimes be controversial, a subject when it comes to youth, as I'm sure I don't need to go into too much detail. But if we utilize it in the platform coming from prevention, it can be more of a priority if we, you know, approach it in a tactful way, thinking about how it helps prevent other forms of violence. So how might it help prevent violence? Why did you all think we included this one? We should have built in like Jeopardy music in the background. There we go, thank you. So on screen, someone said establish basic level of knowledge from which to have further conversation. Yes, great point. It is not always, you know, a dirty taboo topic. It is just basic education about our bodies and about reproduction. Those are things that we all are going to think about and experience. Kids deserve to hear about good sex, healthy relationships, and harmful abusive behaviors. Plus, having knowledge gives agency and promotes autonomy. Beautiful. That is a great kind of nutshell, I think, of what my points are going to be on the next slide. Hint, hint. In the chat, we have sex ed that does not include LGBTQ students or is abstinence only is damaging. Absolutely. So as we know, people are different and have different choices to make in relationships and sexual contact, if it exists or they don't want it at all, whatever it may look like for each person. If we just pretend like it's not a thing, that we disapprove of, LGBTQ plus relationships or sex in general and abstinence only, again, we are not giving them the skills and knowledge that they may need to have, just basic intimate relationships. Next one, part of this is safe sex and not just abstinence only education. Yes, so we know at some point, even if it is when someone's married, if that is your goal, you still should know how to have safe sex, safe and healthy relationships, regardless of when or where that is. For many reasons, but mostly to teach youngsters about how to negotiate and have healthy relationships. Yeah, so I think, like I said, try to approach it tactfully from a prevention point of view was our goal, because just talking about sex ed and puberty and that is one thing, but this obviously is very closely related to healthy relationships, which is prevention in and of itself. I fought to include this in our schools, but so many are still in support of abstinence only, as is our funding. So many of our students are completely uninformed when trying to discuss more specific behaviors like contraception sabotage and types of assault. Yes, so even more detail, I think, on what the last one said, that there's so much more to it than just, preventing infections or preventing pregnancies. It can help students protect their health and well-being as well as their dignity by equipping them with knowledge. Great, I'll get a little bit more in depth on that in a minute. And also knowing the appropriate terms for their bodies. Body parts are not dirty words. So I do a program within my staff. All new staff during the orientation have to see my lovely face. And that is one of the soapboxes of the day, is if they work with youth or in their own lives, they need to teach them the correct names for their body parts. And I have a whole laundry list of reasons, which I won't get into right now. But I always joke that someday I'm gonna make a TikTok video and be famous for a second verse to the head, shoulders, knees, and toes to include your genitals. So keep an eye out for that. Someday it'll be out there.
Please do that, Lisa. Please.
I know, I've been joking about it for like 8 months, so I need to write it down, a draft or something. I'll hire someone who's already on TikTok to make it for me. Is there anything else? Sorry, I got a little on my own soapbox again there. All right, so we'll go on into the recap, and my cat is here to say hi. Talking about genitals got her excited, I guess. All right, so sexual and reproductive health education prevents violence while providing valuable knowledge, which was kind of what all of you said in the last slide. So this is lifelong knowledge that is going to be useful for so many different reasons. And as staff or as school administrators, I think they're maybe more afraid of pushback from parents or whatever, that their kids are learning more than they should. But obviously, as us as preventionists may or may not know, there's so much research that says the earlier the better. Just like every other type of prevention, the more they know, earlier the better. You can do it in a developmentally appropriate way. Increasing your self-esteem and autonomy, especially in young women, which someone sort of mentioned earlier. Yes, so it helps increase your sense of self, which helps to increase your self-esteem, which helps you to create boundaries and stick to them. Being able to name and identify your body parts helps to avoid shame or that taboo, dirty, brain that we have or that we're socialized to have about sexual contact or about our body parts. That often puts it's mostly towards female-bodied people that's the negative thing. We don't talk about female sexual pleasure. We talk about making a baby, which does not necessarily include that. And then also the better sexual health care is really important. As I said, I work in a healthcare field. And if people can't tell you what is wrong or what they need, then how can they get the help that they need? So I was reading an article on this just the other day when preparing, and I gave a really good example of if a female-bodied person goes to a healthcare physician and says that they have pain down there, which is very common. I have worked with teenagers in my clinic before, and oftentimes the word is just down there. And they gave the example of pain in your urethra versus pain in your labia versus pain in your vagina are all very different symptoms and would have very different treatments. So if they don't know where this stuff is, that is very, very damaging, and not only, hurtful to their healthcare, but also in relationships, again, with, intimate partners in the future, and just having healthy sexuality overall. It can include conversations around consent and LGBTQ plus relationships, which we sort of talked about with the gender inclusive one as well, where it's not just all about, the sexual contact. We also can establish healthy relationships, boundaries, what's abusive, what's unhealthy, and make sure that we are inclusive of all types of relationships and identities. And then help to identify and understand, help all identities understand and gain empathy for others. So just like seeing yourself represented in your inclusive language, we can see myself represented in my education and my sexual knowledge and things like that. That I think I'm getting a little bit repetitive, but obviously that goes to show that all of these things are related in their, in their core, if you look at the bigger picture and how this is so important to be in our policies. So I think that's all that I had to add there. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. All right, so thank you all for participating in those, and I'm glad that you definitely have some of those ideas that we already had, so we're not completely outside the box, which is great news. So for the last kind of piece of this, we're going to talk about the challenges and successes that you all may have had while working with policies. And I know a lot of you said that maybe you've had very little experience, and that's fine. Maybe what challenges would you expect? You could kind of think ahead, I'm sure if you have worked with schools, that there's all kinds of challenges and barriers that can come up. So this slide is sort of in two categories if you'd like to use the annotate feature. So it's a little bit clearer, or if it's in the chat, that's fine too. Just maybe make it obvious which one you're responding to. So first, what barriers have you met while trying to change school policies? And then hopefully you have, how have you bypassed or overcome those challenges? So give us some ideas of where you've had issues or and how you've successfully overcome those. Okay, so a barrier, someone said that policies are very closely guarded and don't rewrite without many approvals or even legal approval. Yes, great point. So that's probably the first thing that kind of comes to mind is how do I even do this? Is there room for an outsider to come in and make these suggestions or even write them for them?
We can also say for folks that haven't done policy work or policy change work, what do you anticipate will be a problem? What have you heard from other folks? What are you kind of nervous about? Like, where do you feel like a gap in knowledge is?
Rural schools, lots of traditional, outdated, or faith-based views on education and discipline. All right, yeah, I can definitely see that. And that also gets into the walking on eggshells, where it's hard to say, yeah, your faith-based stuff is outdated. But I definitely think that hopefully our policy, rubric can help sort of, again, come from a place of professionalism and what's the word? I guess just being inclusive, not trying to single out this school where something is wrong with your policies. This is a whole statewide initiative type of thing. So hopefully that can help to overcome that in the future. In the chat, many schools look to check a box for a policy, not actually take the time to create good, inclusive, and useful policies. Yes, so that's definitely true in my experience with reading school policies is sometimes the language is so jargony. It's like, no one understands this. You literally just copied and pasted from the internet somewhere or your legal team wrote it and no student is going to read that 16 paragraph stuff. So I definitely agree with that one. I know when I've done other policy work outside of schools, people balk at the, well, what else will we do instead? And the work that goes into creating new processes. Ultimately, they're hesitant about the culture change. All right, yeah, so not understanding what else there is, what are they, what else could we do, and the time and investment in making that change, especially long-term culture change. That's definitely I don't know, makes your head your eyes go big. We brought comprehensive sex ed into the psychiatric hospital where I worked because we had a champion nurse who pushed hard. Okay, so I'm assuming that maybe is one of your overcomers is finding those champions, which I know is much easier said than done. But the more contacts you make, the more you do try and interact with the school administrators, using whatever position or relationship you already have, maybe doing the school education. Can we reach out to parents or a PTA, or are students, active in asking for what they want, policy change they might be interested in?
I'll share from my agency's perspective. One of the biggest barriers that we've met is just the fact that we're trying to enact systems-wide change, which is hard work. I think all of us who are doing outer level prevention work in any capacity can probably attest to the fact that systems are big and cumbersome and deeply rooted in white supremacy. And the fact of the matter is when we're doing policy level work, we're actively pushing against a system that has been in place for hundreds of years. So it's hard work, and we can't necessarily tear down that systems wide barrier in one day, 1 year, even 5 years. It's going to take a little bit of time. And so coming to terms with the fact that it's bit by bit, and you might only, in looking at our rubric, you might be able to look at a student handbook and say, I'm going to pick and choose my battles. And I really want to make sure that dress codes are included in the policy, and we'll work on zero tolerance language next year. And that's okay. And I think from my agency's perspective, that's some of the work that we've done internally, and how we've kind of circumnavigated, I guess, that barrier of the system.
Yeah, definitely great points from Maria there. I agree. It is a process, and it can be extensive. So if you do, narrow it down a little bit, like she said, to start. One more in the chat was, you also can't push too far or you risk getting prevention programming removed from the school. So it's a balance. Yes, so that is a valid point, that sometimes it is sort of a risk. I will say, again, from my agency's point of view, I have had the relationship with teachers for years and years, going to the same schools, the same teachers. And when I tried to start working on policy review, we would go usually to the principal. They would, contact, name drop in order to get me a meeting with them. And a lot of times the principals had no idea that I was in the health classes or in the school at all. So it wasn't too much, because most of the time the teachers were my champions, but there is that risk that if they find out that something about they didn't know, that could impact your other programming for sure. A barrier of our own as preventionists is the school may be ready for change itself, but a school is not an independent organization or privately owned business. It is part of a federal, state, and local community with dollars and community members tied to it. Change isn't always as fast as we want. What concessions are we willing to negotiate? Yeah, so definitely got to think about the bigger picture there. If you can get, to the higher ups, I know some folks, manage to get to the district level, but oftentimes it's starting small, and see where it goes, where it takes you, little baby steps. Someone agreed with pushing too far comment. We also had children testing positive for STIs, so that was also an area where we could use the evidence to get the info to the kids. All right, great point. So that, as a tangent, sort of, sometimes a champion could be a school nurse. I know that we try to make at least, a table touch to our school nurses with my preventionists in my agency, so that they know that our agency exists, since we can provide that sexual health care. So that may be a good place to start. If there's a lot of kids coming to the school nurse with this, then we could maybe use that as evidence. Also, your counselors, school counselors can be the champions as well, where if they have kids coming to them to talk to them about harassment in the hallways a lot, this might be a good place to start. So yes, I think on that note, we'll go to the next slide in just a second. I think for the support of y'all worried about the big picture stuff and getting to like legal approval stuff, from my personal experience, as I said, working with the principal at many schools, they have the complete power over their school handbook, but not the big policies, because that is district-wide or school board legal jargon. But if they are willing and able to have you work with just the school handbook, which is what the thing most students are going to look at anyways, I find value in starting there, because at least again in my my counties, they have more freedom and more willingness to look into that rather than getting to the higher up stuff. So unless there's any other comments, you can feel free to keep using the chat, but we're going to move to our successes.
Yeah, so we want to, recognize that there are challenges, there are barriers, but we also want to uplift the successes folks have had. And if you haven't done policy work yet, what other successes have you had that have taught you something that could map onto policy work? What successes have you had in changing school policy? And what advice would you give another preventionist? So yeah, use the chat function or annotate on the slide. I feel like success can also be measured a lot of different ways. So what was something that you felt really good about doing, that you maybe got positive feedback on? It doesn't have to be like, well, I went in, losing my voice, I went in and changed the whole handbook on my own, What types of success, or how would you want to measure success? What would success look like to you? This was actually one of the questions that Dr. Roscoe did with us. We had an activity like, what would success look like in 5 years, in 10 years down the line? What measurable things would we want to see, or what tonal shifts within the school would we want to see if there was success? So it was like students feel safe and heard and respected. There are no police officers in schools. There are no metal detectors. So we had to think, what, not just like what language would we see as a success, but what behaviors, what feelings would be seen as success.
When Women Helping Women started to do policy level work, one of our successes was honestly just getting access to the student handbook. So starting off really small. The fact of the matter is schools guard those handbooks and those policies really close to the vest in some cases, especially in larger school systems. So even just getting access and having access to look at those school policies was a success for us, and continues to be a success for us. So it's little baby steps oftentimes.
So someone said, I think a huge success would be schools reaching out to us as experts in the field and wanting our help to revise. We aren't there yet, but we're working on it. Yeah, I think that's a great measure of success. Okay, so one of these responses, in one of our schools, which is faith-based Mennonite, I had lunch with some of our teachers and the principals at the table with us, asking various questions about programming and the education I was giving students. The conversation moved towards a discussion of transgender students, but the principal used some very discriminatory language. I was shocked and excited to see the health teacher I worked with, as well as some of the other teachers, jump in immediately in defense of the LGBTQ+ population and of our programming. It's a great success. Yeah. Yeah, success can be kind of hard to picture because sometimes we think in like the negative terms of it would be the absence of this, instead it would be the presence of this. So I think that even just thinking about what success would look like to you and carrying that forward can be a really helpful activity. Even if you don't have the words right now, it's fine. Yeah, so I feel like people are just going to be kind of mulling that over, so we can move on to the next part.
All right, y'all, we're closing out. We're almost there. So after listening to us talk about our rubric, after brainstorming with each other on the previous couple of slides, how likely do you think you are to begin working on K through 12 school policies? And you can just pop that in the chat. We're just curious. Oh, there's a poll on my screen. Hopefully there's a poll on your screen. Let's see. We'll give y'all a couple of minutes. I'm seeing that about 66% of you have voted, 71%. Give you all a few more seconds.
We did get a clarification on one of the responses in the chat. They had a definitely not, but only because it's outside their scope of practice, not because they're not interested.
We understand. All right, so I'm gonna end the poll, and it looks like a lot of you, I'll share the results. It looks like a lot of you want to start or want to continue working on school policies, which is exciting to see, honestly, from at least my perspective. Policy work is, again, really hard work, but when we're thinking about changing entire cultures within a school environment, this is a good place to start. And with that, I want to talk a little bit about our pilot process for our rubric, because we want to lean on your expertise, your knowledge, and your skills to really hopefully create a successful pilot process. So we're actually going to be piloting our rubric and model policies with folks from around the state from July 1st through September 1st of 2021, so of this year. It's creeping up, July 1st is creeping up on us, but we want to ensure that we have a breadth of experiences and knowledge from folks from around the state. And so we want you all to help us in that pilot process. So if you feel comfortable, you can scan the QR code on the screen or go to the bit.ly on the screen and sign up to receive communications from our work group for next steps in that pilot process. So what we envision happening is us sending probably you the model rubric once we make final tweaks and changes to it. And then you using that model rubric that we created to go through and review one of your school's policies or multiple schools' policies. We want as much data as we can gather in that process. And we'll be, again, kind of piloting that from July 1st through September 1st. So you have a couple of months to do that kind of work. And honestly, that pilot can look a lot of different ways depending on how you are already working within your school environment. So you can work collaboratively with a school administrator if you have a close relationship with them. You can do this work individually by yourself or with your team if you have access to a school policy. I know that when I was starting to do school policy review with my team at Women Helping Women, it was really helpful to get together all in one space, or whether that's virtually or in the office together, and go through a school policy together to make sure that all of our minds we're working together. And that was one of the things that came up during the rubric process for us, was that we were all coming from so many different spaces that it was helpful to have a couple of different eyes on just creating the elements. So I can imagine that during this pilot process, it would be helpful to have a few different people doing this pilot with us. So, and then once you fill out and once you use the rubric, we'll send you an evaluation. So to fill out, to just get some honestly qualitative feedback in creating a better, hopefully more comprehensive rubric to send out eventually to folks from across the state, because that's one of our goals, is to hopefully have a working rubric that folks from across the state can use by the end of 2021.
Can I just add, for a little bit of extra motivation, my piece of advice from one of the previous slides would be that using something like this, whether it's our rubric or something else, as evidence to come into a school, So like Maria said, if you have access to the school handbook, which is usually accessible, you could, pick a few sections and review it on your own, and then bring that to the administrators or whoever your contacts may be and say, hey, look at this document that I have from, the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, ODH work groups, yada, yada. Sort of to have a reason to meet with them rather than just like, oh, hey, there's this thing I want to do, but I have no beginning steps. So having some kind of like, tangible thing to come to that first meeting or first contact, I think is pretty valuable, so that you put in a little bit of work beforehand as well.
Mm-hmm.
So sign up.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lisa. And I also want to mention the fact that if you just like have access to a school policy and you're not necessarily ready to take this kind of work to the administration, in our pilot process, we're strictly looking at the rubric. We're not looking at any sort of outcome beyond you using the rubric. So if you feel like you have access to a school policy, you have time to help us with this pilot process, but you don't want to bring it to the administration, that's also fine with us. We're not looking with that evaluation at the end of our pilot process will not touch on any sort of outcome with the school. All right. And with that, our presentation is finished, but we would be happy to answer any lingering questions you all have. You can pop them in the chat or unmute yourself if you feel comfortable. And just in case you want to contact any of us for clarification or more information, our email addresses are on the screen. Katie or Lisa, are there any chats?
There are some kind words from folks in the chat. So great job. Your group has done a lot of work and done it well. Thank you. Someone said thank you all for the presentation. Very much appreciated. Someone said no questions, but thank you for the information about your process and the creation of the rubric. And thank you for teaching me about the annotation feature. Thanks for your kind words, y'all. This has been like a year in the making. And we are so proud of everything we've accomplished so far. And we're just really excited about this work.
Yeah, I echo everything that Katie just said. I'm really proud of the work that our group has done thus far, and I'm really excited to see what we do in the future. And thank you for joining us today. I'm excited. I was excited to share it with all of you.
Absolutely. Your wisdom and your experience and your insight, we knew that this would be a great group to share with and to learn from. So we're very thankful for participation and your time.
So sorry, I had an issue with my mute. Thank you so much for the presentation. We're gonna go ahead and break for lunch. We won't be resuming again and coming back for another workshop session until 1 p.m. And the CEU code word is prevention. And I'm also gonna drop that into the chat with the link to get back to your workshop session. You just click the link for whatever workshop you're gonna go to. All right, enjoy your lunch.